Yeah, but if you have a job like to teach or something, right? You want like I got you. And they have to attract grad students, so they have to like have the most people or whatever, because they need money. I don't know.
You're all right. No worries at all. Yay! All right, thank you. Okay, it is my very great pleasure to introduce the 9th annual GVR Khodadad Lecture on the neurobiology of EPS, excessive pathological selfishness. Now you may be scratching your heads a bit about both GVR Khodadad and excessive pathological selfishness. So on the next slide, I am going to clarify these mysteries. Thank you. Thanks. Can I use the keyboard or? Oh, shoot.
If you just click with the,
I think you should be able to use it. There we go. Okay, thank you so much. All right, so GVR Khodadad stands for Garmin, Victor, and Razi Khodadad. They have the GVR Khodadad Family Foundation, and it is dedicated to promoting the study of excessive pathological selfishness. All right, and I will mention that for a time they were actually supporting research on this at Penn, and both Joe Cable, who's here, Kristin, who also worked on this research with thanks to the Khodadads, as well as Ted Brodkin and Adrian Rain, I think, is that the total cast of characters? Yes, have all worked on this problem. And the Khodadads continue to support this lecture series. So the next question is, well, what is EPS? What is this thing that the Khodadads are pursuing? And they believe that excessive pathological selfishness is at the root of many social problems, but little research has been directed towards understanding it. Basically very little. So when we started doing our research here at Penn, we were like, how do we even get a handle on this new concept? But we grappled, and we did. We've done some neuroscience research, some of which Kristin is going to tell us about. We've done some genetics research in animals and in humans, which Ted Brodkin has done. The thing that I want to stress is selfishness per se is kind of viewed as like a bad thing. But what Garmin Khodadad has pointed out is a certain level of selfishness is normal and to be expected, because any creatures who weighted the needs of others equivalently to the needs of themselves would not have stuck around very long to have progeny. So basically our lineage comes from people who maintained a certain preference for resources for themselves versus resources for others. But of course we also know that humans are capable of freely giving resources to others, and this is an area that Kristin has made important contributions to. So the question is, what's going on when people are extremely selfish, beyond what you normally encounter? This is the selfishness that is at the root of many social problems. And, can we get enough of a handle on the neuroscience and the genetics of it that maybe we could even diminish excessive pathological selfishness? So without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker today. Kristin Brethel-Haurwitz got her PhD at Georgetown in cognitive neuroscience. She came to Penn and was a member of Joe Cable's lab, and that's where she started this interesting research. She's currently a social and behavioral scientist administrator at the OBSSR, NIH Office of Behavioral and Social Science Research. But asterisk, she is not speaking on behalf of NIH. They're very, very fussy about that. She's here giving her views about research that she has done on GPS. So I think that does it. Yeah. I'll let Natalie switch to the brain if you can. Thank you. Oh, and
No, it's fine.
Okay.
Great.
All right, can everybody hear me? I have not given a talk in a mask before. I have not actually given any talk in 2.5 years, so to work through the kinks a little bit. Thank you so much, Martha, for that introduction. It's very exciting to be back here. As she mentioned, I was a postdoc here at Penn prior to and during the start of the pandemic, so I don't think I've been in this room since late February or early March 2020, so it's nice to be back and also see some people I haven't seen in person since that time. Yes, I'm going to be talking about work that I did prior as a Georgetown grad student on altruism, work that I did here at Penn, and also some additional work on well-being that's relevant to both altruism and selfishness. As Martha mentioned, so the research presented in this talk was conducted prior to my current position, Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences at the National Institutes of Health, and is presented in my private capacity today. The content of the talk is solely the responsibility of the authors. It does not necessarily represent the official views or endorsement of the United States government or the National Institutes of Health. However, relevant but unrelated research reported in this talk was partially supported by a National Institute of Mental Health of the National Institutes of Health under a postdoc award. I just want to start off with acknowledgements just to make sure that these are covered and don't get lost in the end. So this is, of course, the results of generous funding from the Khodadad family, also from the NIMH and the John Templeton Foundation. And also, any research is a team effort, so I definitely want to recognize the Cable Lab, the Othis Lab, and also the Laboratory on Social and Effective Neuroscience, where I did my graduate work. Okay. Selfish and proud is what this guy is saying. So this is a protester at the Pennsylvania State House in Harrisburg in May 2020, protesting ongoing COVID mitigation measures, specifically stay-at-home orders. I saved this image when I first saw it at the time, thinking it would be great to include in a talk on my postdoc work one day. It's nice that that day has come, but unfortunate that this is still a reality that we're living with every day. Thankfully, that very same week, there was also this incredibly heartening headline highlighting how the non-selfish actions of so many Philadelphians saved thousands of lives and kept tens of thousands out of our hospitals, likely saving these hospitals from collapse. And multiply this across cities and countries, and the anti-selfish effect in which we all made sacrifices that saved the lives of so many strangers is really overwhelming. And these snapshots of our last 20 months highlight that humans are capable of significant altruism in addition to significant selfishness. And I'm going to describe a series of studies that I've done, both here at Penn and also in my graduate work at Georgetown, to better understand altruism, selfishness, and also the role that well-being plays in both of these social orientations. So just to outline, I'm going to cover a few different research topics. So first, what is altruism? It's important to define this right off the bat, and also how can we actually study this in the lab? Next, I'm specifically going to look at empathy for pain and fear in the brain. And then I'm going to discuss some work I did here at Penn on the selfish personality, and also manipulating selfishness in the brain with neuroscience methods. And lastly, I'm going to cover some work that kind of links some of this together on well-being and altruism across the United States and also across the world. And there's a few themes that are going to keep coming up as I'm discussing these research studies that I think connect to them nicely. One is thinking of empathy, altruism, selfishness as all part of a proposed caring continuum, connecting altruism and selfishness as two extremes. Thinking about discounting of outcomes across social distance and also caring for strangers. So we're much more likely to sacrifice things for those who have close social relationships with us, and this kind of trails off as social relationships become more distant. But this can definitely depend on the person and the situation as well. Then I'm also going to discuss the idea of empathic propensity or tendency and ability and how these might be related and how they might diverge. So the population of altruists that we studied in our altruism research is altruistic kidney donors. So most of you might not know much about about altruistic kidney donation, which is the donation of one of your kidneys to a stranger while living, which is possible because we have two and you actually only need one for relatively normal function. So I'll tell you a little bit about these altruists, and then I'll review a little bit about what we know about people's perceptions of this type of altruism. And then I'll spend some more time talking about research that we've done with this group. All right, so the reason altruistic kidney donation exists is because there's a great need. Kidney disease is the 8th leading cause of death in the United States. Over 90,000 people were on the wait list when I checked this morning. Over 3,800 died while waiting for a kidney in 2019. And this is despite over 18,000 donations of kidneys in that year. The bulk of these come from deceased donors, over 11,000. Over 6,800 came from living donors, and again, this is because we can donate one of our kidneys and still have a healthy life. As you might suspect, a lot of these come from family members or friends who donate to someone in need. However, 388 of these in 2019 came from these non-directed altruistic donors who saw a need. Many of them just went to their local hospital, say, I have an extra kidney, can I give one away? And it goes to a total stranger. It's an anonymous donation. And note that all of this information is specific to the United States. So there's been about 3,400 donations in the United States to date, altruistic kidney donations. This is a very small part of the total US population. Very few people have done this, as you might imagine. You're probably thinking about this yourself and how this might relate to your own ideas about altruism. So we see this as kind of fitting the criteria of some of the most stringent definitions of altruism in humans. It's rare, it's costly, and while you can have a relatively normal life after donating a kidney, it is still major surgery, obviously, that you're volunteering for. It's directed towards non-kin. Usually this is a total stranger, but it's certainly someone they didn't have a relationship with prior to the donation. And it's anonymous. A lot of these donors, they never find out who their kidney went to, and they never have a connection with that person. And for a clear definition of altruism, I find this one from Daniel Batson to be useful. Altruism is a motivational state with the ultimate goal of increasing another's welfare. And again, I think this describes people who donate a kidney to a stranger pretty well. And I'll describe in more detail when I get to our studies of altruistic kidney donors that we conducted. Batson and others have also hypothesized that empathy is an important precursor for altruism. But first I'm going to talk a little bit about perceptions of kidney donors. So what's up with people who do this? You're probably thinking this yourself currently. I assume the reaction you're currently having is much like the title to this 2003 paper, and you're wondering if they are lunatics or saints. So potentially contradicting this assumption that altruistic kidney donors must be one of either of these extremes In this paper, they cited survey data showing that up to half of those surveyed said they would donate one of their kidneys to a stranger. And while those numbers are getting a little bit old, this isn't a scientific survey. I think it's interesting to look at the results of this poll that was conducted by the Washington Post that they tacked onto an article about one of our studies several years ago. Are there any guesses? Who's endorsed that they would, yeah, I'll give one of my kidneys to a stranger, no problem. Any guesses on the first one? High, low, what do we think?
I would say half.
Half?
Because there's zero commitment.
Yeah, that's true. It's a non-scientific poll. It's very low stakes. Nobody's going to see if you're endorsing this on the Washington Post. Yeah.
I would guess like 10%, even half of the actually donate it,
Mm-hmm.
consider it,
Mm-hmm.
lower.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would have expected something closer to 10%, but actually 70% of people, again, this is, there's no cost to saying yes on this survey. They're not going to get called up to donate one of their kidneys tomorrow. Thankfully for them, probably. But a whopping 69% of respondents on this, again, unscientific poll, said they would donate a kidney to a stranger. And I think it's interesting that so many readers are endorsing this possibility. So what do we know about these altruistic kidney donors? What might be the emotional, social, or neural processes that make such altruism possible? So starting about a decade ago, with my graduate advisor, we started recruiting these donors for behavioral and neuroimaging studies to find out. And while we don't know a whole lot about these real-world altruists, or at least we didn't at that point, we did know about a group that we expected to lie at the other end of a hypothesized caring continuum. And these are people with psychopathic traits. These are individuals particularly low on empathy and remorse, a lack of close, meaningful relationships, and a tendency towards selfish, antisocial behavior. This would be one group that we would think of as excessively pathologically selfish. And we think there might be sort of a normal curve of caring and empathic sensitivity, with those low on caring demonstrating psychopathic traits, and those high in caring engaging in altruistic behaviors like donating a kidney, with most of us falling somewhere in between. So how might we be able to test this? And one approach we had taken is testing sensitivity to distress cues. So distress cues, including the fearful facial expression, it elicits help. And previous research has shown that people who are most accurate in recognizing fearful facial expressions are most pro-social. They engage in the most helping behavior. We also know that psychopathic individuals, those with high on psychopathic traits, are particularly bad at recognizing these expressions and show atypical neural processing of fearful faces, particularly in an area of the brain called the amygdala. So the first set of tasks we did with altruistic kidney donors were pretty straightforward. Look at emotional faces while we conduct functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. And this allows us to see blood flow in the brain, which is a proxy for neural activity. And we showed participants fearful, angry, and neutral faces while they were in the scanner. And again, we were most interested in the fearful facial expression. And after the scan, we also presented participants with the 6 basic emotions that are often considered in these studies, and simply asked them to pick the correct labels. And again, we were particularly interested in fear and how accurate participants were in labeling it. While this might seem very straightforward, there actually is some interesting variation in this task. And before I get into the results, I'll just note that our control group in this study was just healthy adults who have not donated a kidney to a stranger. So unless someone here has done that, that would be most of us in this room. So as predicted, when we look at brain activity in response to fear in particular, we see that altruists have greater amygdala activation. And importantly, this effect was specific to fear. Altruists didn't have greater amygdala activation in response to those angry faces. So this was a way to determine that they aren't just more reactive to emotions or negative emotions in general. And again, this is the opposite of what had been seen previously in individuals high on psychopathic traits, who tend to have underreactive amygdala in response to And when we look at the amygdala activation data against the explicit fear recognition data, we find the better participants are at recognizing fear, the more responsive their amygdala was to fearful expressions in the scanner. So I'm going to go into our next series of studies now. So we've seen that altruists show different and perhaps heightened neural responses to distress in others. But how does this relate to the self-other matching that is perhaps most indicative of what we refer to as emotional empathy? So when you're really feeling for another person and an emotional situation. So this is feeling badly when someone else is upset, or even cringing when you feel someone in pain or feeling a negative emotion itself. So building on a large body of empathy for pain research, we examined empathy for pain and also anticipatory fear of pain in strangers in the fMRI scanner for altruistic pain donors and controls. So this is what our task looked like. So we had 3 sets of trials that they were doing this task, but for each set, so first they're hearing a tone, and it either suggests that it's a safe trial or there is a potential for pain upcoming shortly. Then they're either receiving painful stimulation to their thumbnail, they're getting their thumb squished a bit in the scanner, or they're not, and then they have a rest period in between trials. So this allows us to look at what's going on during the experience of pain and also the potentially fearful anticipation of pain upcoming. And also across these trials, they're either observing a total stranger in this situation while they're in the scanner, they're observing the stranger and also given a prompt to empathize, which I'll go into more detail in a minute, or they're experiencing the pain themselves. And by looking at all of these conditions, we can directly compare what's going on in the brain when you're experiencing pain yourself and also when you're observing pain in another. So in addition to examining this paradigm in real-world altruists, this study was also useful in that it examined empathy for pain in a stranger. So the person they're observing, this was actually a live video feed of a co-participant in the study who we recruited. And they only had a very brief introduction before the scan, so this is a stranger to them. It's not someone they had any relationship with. In contrast, many earlier empathy for pain studies, when they brought participants in, they might have co-recruited a girlfriend or a boyfriend or a sibling, so they're expecting them to have a significant empathic reaction to their pain. Whereas this might be perhaps less likely to happen when you're observing a stranger. So what we're most interested in this study is overlap and similarity in neural activation when participants are experiencing pain themselves and when they're observing pain in another person. And this is a sort of neural marker of the emotional resonance that characterizes empathy. So first we'll look at pain and we'll look at activation just for the self condition. So you can see the brain is quite active when you're experiencing that squishing of your thumbnail there. And the altruistic controls show largely similar activation for the first-hand experience of pain, including bilateral activation in anterior insula. This is an area of the brain known to be particularly responsive, especially to interoceptive stimuli like pain. And in a conjunction analysis, in which we looked at significant activation at a set thresholds for both the self and other pain conditions, we can see that altruists are demonstrating an observably larger self-other overlap, which is what I'm showing on the right here. And specifically, altruists show that overlap in bilateral insula, whereas this was only significant in right insula in controls. They're showing more of this self-other overlap of neural activation, specifically in this pain-sensitive area for self and other. And we actually see a similar pattern for the anticipation period. So this is just when they got a tone that pain might be upcoming. And neural activation for the self-fearful anticipation condition again looks largely similar, especially in this anterior insula region. But again, while altruists have bilateral overlap in anterior insula, this is less extensive in controls. So it appears here that self-other overlap for distress extends to fearful anticipation in addition to pain, and is therefore relatively general to these distress-related emotions. to speak up about things. So recall from the task design that there was also a condition in which participants were instructed to empathize with their partner. Specifically, they were told, please watch your partner during the following session of the task closely. As you watch and listen, please imagine how your partner is feeling during the task. Really try to understand her thoughts and emotions during each trial of the task. And returning to the idea that empathy is an important precursor to altruism, this prompt was adapted from some earlier work by Daniel Batson. And my colleague Katie O'Connell recently used multivariate analyses both to confirm the analyses that I had done and just shown you, and also to investigate the effect of this empathy prompt. What I'm showing here is that these real-world altruists exhibited more similar representations of experienced and observed fearful anticipation spontaneously and also following that empathy prompt. And again, this is in significant regions in what was referred to as the neural pain matrix. This is the anterior insula and the interior middle cingulate cortex, suggesting heightened both empathic tendencies and abilities with respect to fear in these altruists. And as highlighted earlier, during pain, altruists were distinguished by their spontaneous empathic responses, but here they showed no difference from controls after the empathy prompt. And a lack of difference between these groups after the specific empathy prompt shows that while altruists differ in greater tendency, greater spontaneous reaction, there is similar ability, suggesting room for increased empathy, similar to that shown by default in these extraordinary altruists in the average person. So similar to the earlier studies of empathy for pain in which the observed study partner was a loved one, or the study of, for example, in-group versus out-group members, it's as if altruists are spontaneously responding to the partner as an in-group member, while this is not the case for controls. And such a hypothesis is supported by some questionnaire data that we collected after the scan, in which we asked participants to rate the subjective closeness of a variety of social relationships. And while we can see that altruists and controls are no different from most relationships, altruists rate themselves as significantly closer to a stranger in general, and also to the unknown study partner in particular, despite the same amount of exposure to this person as the control participants. And this idea is further supported by results we saw from an economic paradigm called social discounting that we collected from the altruists and the matched controls. And without going into too much detail, this tests how much money you're willing to forego to share with another person. And you're asked about this for several social distances, ranging from those who are particularly close to you to those who are particularly distant. And that's what's shown for social distance on the x-axis there. And what you're seeing is the typical sort of degradation we see where people are less willing to give up money to share with more distant social relationships. But also what you're seeing is that blue line is flatter than the orange line. So the altruists are showing less of this degradation of sharing with more distant social relationships. So to bring our discussion of characteristics of perceptions together, I'll return to two very different statistics I presented earlier. So an exceedingly small proportion of the American population has donated food to a stranger. Yet up to 70% of people say that this is something that they might do. And maybe the number of altruistic donors can be much closer to the latter than the former, given our neurocognitive results, which would wipe out that large waiting list that I showed you at the beginning in no time. And again, given our result of equivalent neural resonance for pain following an empathy prompt, there's evidence that there are empathic processes for which altruists might have a heightened propensity or tendency, but not necessarily a heightened ability, potentially highlighting room where all of us could become more empathic and more altruistic. And evidence for such optimism comes from the steadily increasing number of altruistic donors each year, exceeding 300 for the first time in 2018. So just to summarize these studies on altruism, your initial reaction might have been and how they've been described includes both lunatics and saints. And such extraordinary altruists do have enhanced tendency toward empathy for strangers, we've seen in our studies. But these enhancements occur via relatively ordinary neurocognitive mechanisms, common across individuals, including distress sensitivity in the amygdala and enhanced resonance in the neural pain matrix. And these results suggest that even extraordinary acts of altruism may be something that many more of us might be capable of. Now turning to the selfish components of the studies I'm going to highlight. So my postdoc work at Penn was focused on better understanding excessive selfishness as the other end of this continuum. And before we dove into the neuroscience of selfishness, we wanted to better understand selfishness as a personality trait and how it relates to other personality traits. Also how selfish behaviors may vary across contexts and from self-reports to economic gains and to everyday behaviors. So in a series of large online survey studies, we sought to answer the following questions. So first, what is the selfish personality? Next, how does it relate to both emotional and cognitive empathy? So as I highlighted before, emotional empathy is this sort of co-feeling that we have with other people. When someone is feeling upset, you might feel negatively yourself. Whereas cognitive empathy is more the perspective taking, putting yourself in someone else's shoes. It's also referred to as mentalizing. How does selfishness relate to both psychopathic and narcissistic traits? In their most extreme, these are psychopathologies, but they're also traits that vary throughout the population. And we're particularly interested in the aspects of psychopathy and narcissism associated with cold-heartedness, entitlement, and exploitativeness. And finally, how do decisions in economic gains relate to selfish personality and also real-world social behaviors? Okay, so we looked at this in 2 samples of US adults on a survey platform called MTurk. So this is a large online study conducted nationally. And each study had a sample of 317 adults from all across the United States that responded to our economic gains and also our self-report questionnaires. We had 3 tasks. The one I'm going to focus on is called the dictator game, and I'm going to go into that in more detail in just a moment. But we also elected 2 related tasks called the commons dilemma and the prisoner's dilemma, which you might be familiar with. First of which is exploiting resources. So you're sharing resources with a few partners in the study, so how much do you take for yourself versus allowing for others? And the prisoner's dilemma is a dilemma of cooperation or defection, these outcomes and trying to improve your own outcome over others. So our self-report questionnaires fell into a few categories. One of these was psychopathic traits. Another was narcissistic traits. We also collected several measures of empathy, both emotional and cognitive empathy. We actually used 2 different questionnaires to try to really understand the relationship there. We also looked at self-reported selfishness. This was actually this questionnaire developed by Professor Rain here at Penn as a part of this series of work. And that was asking about everyday selfish behaviors that participants are self-reporting, ranging from what might be considered adaptive, kind of the little selfish acts we engage in every day, to more extreme pathological types of selfish behavior. And we also looked at greed as a related but distinct concept to see how this would relate to selfishness, particularly in the dictator game. Okay, so to go into more detail of the dictator game. So across a series of trials, participants are unilaterally deciding how to divide endowment of tokens, each worth points and worth money, between themselves and a random other participant. So it's referred to as a dictator game because you're sort of the dictator. You're making the decision, the other person gets no input on what the divide of resources is going to be. So this game, that was also the case, but there was also an added feature of it where there was a variable exchange rate, and this modulates the cost of giving across trials. So you can see in this specific example of dividing 90 tokens, the tokens you hold here are going to be worth less than the tokens that you're passing. So here you might have added an incentive to share with your partner if you're trying to increase the overall amount of payoff. And exchange rates range from 3 to 1 to 1 to 3, with the 1 to 1 exchange rate being equivalent to the standard dictator game that you might be more familiar with. And participants completed 20 one-shot choices with their partner in this online study. And importantly, this task was incentive compatible, meaning one of the choices was randomly selected, and they did actually get that money added to their payment for the study, and also their partner did get any money that was shared on that trial. In all cases, decisions were private, and participants only received information on total payoffs, so they're not concerned about any potential reputation or repercussions when they're going through these things. And I just want to briefly highlight the potential outcomes of decisions, since this was our central task in the study. So we'll look at a few distributions of money for the self and also for the other participant. So in this example, $4 was kind of a start for self and other. So if you're sharing evenly in this case, the generosity in this case, how much money you're sharing with the other person is $4. Again, if you this 4-4 divide, your inequity, just the absolute difference between the two, is 0. But we also looked in particular at advantageous and disadvantageous inequity. And here, because it was an equal divide between the two, there was neither advantageous nor disadvantageous inequity. But as you'll see in this breakdown here, if you keep 2 for yourself and give 4 to the other, here the difference is we're now seeing disadvantageous inequity. So it's disadvantageous because you're now giving more to the other person. So in this case, it's 2, the difference between 2 and 4. And if you flip it the other way around, this is now advantageous inequity, in which you have more than the other person. So these are correlations between measures that we collected, correcting for multiple comparisons. And I know this is a lot to take in and probably hard to see, so I'm going to highlight a few results for you.
One question. Is advantageous inequity the same thing as selfishness?
So we focused on that measure because we do see it as closest to selfishness. So it's keeping more resources for yourself relative to the other person. Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, as I just pointed out with this arrow here, we're focusing on that advantageous inequity. I know it's hard to see, so I'll just correct the results here. And it was strongly associated with the other dictator game outcomes. And also, we didn't look so much at disadvantageous inequity because participants didn't create too much disadvantageous inequity. As you might imagine, they like to hold on to more resources themselves. So importantly, this advantageous inequity, it was also correlated with decisions in the Coleman's dilemma and the prisoner's dilemma, and also with self-reported greed and selfishness, suggesting it's a reliable measure of selfishness with respect to these other measures, and we saw this in both of our studies. So for personality associations, we saw both bivariate correlations with emotional empathy, but we also looked, skipping ahead. So looking at psychopathic and narcissistic traits first. So both psychopathic cold-heartedness and also narcissistic entitlement and exploitativeness were independent positive predictors of selfishness in both studies in this class. This means if you're higher on this trait of cold-heartedness associated with psychopathic traits, this is kind of what it sounds like. It's a lack of remorse, a lack of caring for others. You're engaging in more selfish behavior. And also if you're endorsing more items on being entitled or wanting to exploit resources relative to others, you're engaging in more selfish behavior. Perhaps not too surprising, but it is interesting to see if you both are independently contributing to this selfish behavior. It's not entirely driven by one or the other. Empathy associations varied a bit more. Across studies and measures, emotional empathy in particular was an independent and strong predictor of selfishness in this dictator-driven task. And in study 2, the newer empathy measure, cognitive empathy was also an independent predictor, but it is a independent positive predictor. So controlling for emotional empathy, just like cognitive empathy, actually the more cognitive empathy you have, the more selfishness you're engaging in, which might sound a little confusing and odd at first, but this is actually consistent with what we see in people high in psychopathic traits. Their emotional empathy is pretty deficient, but cognitive empathy is relatively intact. And we're kind of paralleling that with this analysis here where if we're holding and controlling for emotional empathy, we actually see a significant relationship in the other direction for cognitive empathy. In study 2, we additionally collected data on some real-world pro-social behaviors. Approximately half the sample reported being registered as a deceased organ donor, which might be something you do on your driver's license. This was consistent with national rates at the time. And such registered donors created less advantageous empathy in the dictator game. They engaged in less selfishness. This was also the case for blood donors. Participants who had ever donated blood, which was about half our sample, again created less advantageous empathy and engaged in less selfishness in this dictator game. However, looking at another variable, this didn't quite reach significance with volunteering. Wasn't quite strong enough. So such findings highlight the external validity of selfish behavior in the dictator game that we used, and that those who are less selfish in the dictator game also tend to be more pro-social in real-world behaviors. So just to highlight these results, so selfish behavior in the dictator game was reliably associated with self-reported selfishness, selfishness in other economic games, and also real-world behavior. And we just really wanted to validate this test before we moved on to another study where we used it, and it's great to see these results. Selfish behavior was consistently negatively predicted by self-reported emotional empathy, and associations with self-reported cognitive empathy were a little less clear and consistent. And also, selfish behavior was consistently associated with the cold-hearted aspect of psychopathy and the exploitative aspect of narcissism. So our next question that we wanted to tackle with another study was, can we go beyond these correlational associations to better understand selfish tendencies? So these results overall continue to support this idea of a caring continuum, especially given the trait and empathy results that we've seen. And it appears that empathy may be necessary for preventing selfishness. And one causal technique we have is to inhibit brain activity. We can do this non-invasively, which I'll describe in more detail in just a minute. And we can do this to see if part of the empathy network, for example, is causally involved in this type of behavior. In particular, in the next series of studies I'm going to describe, we're going to focus on the cognitive empathy network. We saw less strong results in this first survey study, and this could have been a limitation of self-report, potentially. So we still wanted to examine the role of cognitive empathy, given some prior work. And also, as I'll explain in a moment, this area is better able to be targeted with brain stimulation. Okay, so while a large network of neural regions has been implicated in the social cognition necessary for pro-social and altruistic behaviors, a region of particular interest for other regard and caring for others is the temporal parietal junction, or TPJ. Here depicted as the hub of cognitive empathy we use to understand the mental states of others. And across many neuroimaging studies, including this early study from Lee and Young, the TPJ has been implicated in mentalizing and also moral judgment. Here, responding most strongly when judging the morality of an actor with an attempted harmful negative intention, regardless of the actual outcome of that behavior. And more recently, the TPJ has emerged as a region that appears to code distance relative to the self, across space, time, and also social relationships. And other fMRI studies have shown that TPJ structure and function are associated with altruism, particularly the conflict between selfish and altruistic decisions. In this study, TPJ volume and activation was associated with the willingness to pay for an altruistic act. In another study, it was found that TPJ activation predicts perspective taking during donation decisions. And also TPJ activation was associated with the relative weight of this cognitive empathy, perspective taking, versus emotional empathy in donation decisions across participants. So next I want to highlight what this looks like in a task that I brought up earlier, the social discounting task, in which participants decided how to share monetary resources across a variety of social distances, ranging from those closest to them to a mere acquaintance. And this, again, allows us to better understand social preference behavior across a range of social relationships. And as is typically seen in this task, there's this hyperbolic social discounting function in which participants are less willing to forego resources from more socially distant relationships. And here in particular, they found that right TPJ activation was associated with generosity, and also that it modulated a conflict between generosity and selfishness during generous decisions. And importantly for what we were interested in, the authors followed up on these social discounting results to examine the causal role of the TPJ on generosity across social distances. They applied a method called transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, to the right TPJ, and found that this caused an even steeper discounting curve than in the control condition. So participants are even further discounting outcomes from more socially distant relationships. So the take-home message here is that when activity in the right TPJ was temporarily inhibited, participants became more selfish with respect to those more distant social relationships, providing some first causal evidence for the role of the TPJ in other regard behavior. Though interestingly, this didn't change their behavior towards those more close social relationships. And last study to highlight before I move on to the study that we conducted, I want to highlight one more interesting aspect of the TPJ. Another fMRI study found that TPJ activation predicts social decisions, here in a simulated poker game, particularly for social interaction partners judged to be more informative. So in this case, that was humans versus computers. Thus, it seems that the TPJ is also involved in considering who it is that we're interacting with, and how this should inform our own choices. So these prior findings led us to two hypotheses about the causal role of the TPJ in other regard and social decisions. So our first hypothesis is that the RTPJ, right TPJ, might be causally important for other regard. In this case, TMS to the right TPJ will increase selfishness overall, as has been suggested by some prior studies. Another hypothesis might be that RTPJ is causally important for considering the interaction partner in this decision. In this case, right TPJ TMS would modulate selfishness depending on the interaction partner. And differentiating between these two potential outcomes is supported by the social discounting results I just reviewed, in which concern for the other partner wasn't decreased across the board, but was relative to social distance. So first I'll give a broad overview of our task structure, and then I'll zoom in on some of the details in the next several slides. So this was a fully within subjects design with 4 conditions. In half the conditions, participants received inhibitory TMS to the right TPJ, and in the other half of the conditions, participants received inhibitory TMS to a control region with vertex. So I'll describe TMS more in just a moment. But here we're targeting either the right TPJ or an area called the vertex. And this is actually right where the two halves of the brain come together, so you're actually unlikely hitting the vertex when you apply TMS there, but the feeling of the TMS is quite similar for the control. And we had 2 social conditions. Participants were playing that same dictator game that I highlighted earlier, both with a random future participant who was simply identified as a subject number on the computer screen, and also with a present study partner who was a fellow participant in the study. And just to show you what this looks like here, in this case, both participants were strangers, but this setup allows us to see if the TPJ might be more important for responding to more or less abstract social partners in this paradigm. So since not everyone may be familiar with TMS as a method, I thought I'd briefly review it before going into further detail. It's a relatively non-invasive method for modulating neural activity in relatively focal areas of cortex. Pulses of electric current induce magnetic fields in a coil that cause electric current in the brain. And continuous theta burst stimulation, which is the type used in this study, is thought to have a mainly inhibitory effect. So this is, despite what it might look like in this figure, it's a non-invasive method that we can use. And it's also temporary, so effects only last about 20 or 30 minutes or so, depending on how you use the TMS. And I won't go through this in too much detail again, but it's the same task that I highlighted before, this originative theory. And they're doing 20 of these one-shot decisions per partner per session, so across the whole study they're doing this 80 times. And again, this was a consequential study, so their decisions in this task, one of them is being selected to count for real, so it is actually affecting their payment, and they know this ahead. So here's our hypotheses again in terms of these outcomes. So if the right TPJ is causally important for under regard, we would expect a main effect of TMS target on advantageous inequity. So if we're potentially inhibiting the right TPJ, we would expect this to increase advantageous inequity regardless of the social partner. But rather, if right TPJ is causally important for considering the interaction partner, here we would expect the TMS target by social condition interaction on advantageous inequity.
Which again is selfish.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So again, we're focusing on advantageous inequity in particular. This is when you hold on to more resources for yourself relative to your partner, which, of the outcomes of the indicator, we would consider this to be closest to what we would consider to be selfishness. So this figure, what you're seeing on the left here, so this is looking at their level of advantageous inequity across all of the conditions, both the two TPJ conditions and the two vertex conditions, for both the present and the minimally identified abstract partner. And what you can see here is in the vertex, the control condition on the right half of that graph A, there's a differentiation for they're creating more advantageous inequity when it's that minimally identified abstract partner relative to the partner who's sitting in the room with them. However, when we temporarily inhibit the right TPJ with TMS, this differentiation between the two partners is eliminated, and they're treating them basically equivalently. They're no longer being more selfish towards that more abstract partner. Just to show you what disadvantageous inequity looks like, again, participants did not create much disadvantageous inequity in this task. They chose to hold on for more themselves, more selfish behavior in this task, so we don't see any particular effects of TMS. Okay, so to sum up our results by returning to our hypotheses, we did not find support for an overall increase in selfishness with right TPJ inhibition, but we did see the effect of right TPJ inhibition on advantageous inequity, in particular this measure of selfishness, modulated by the study partner. This is just a summary of the study, and what I'm going to consider next is what might be, and this is one way we might shift people where they are on that potential caring continuum, and what might be other ways to shift someone's behavior on a caring continuum, especially beyond the individual which we're looking at here. So to be clear, what I'm going to be talking about here is going to be correlational data analyses, but the associations are promising for better understanding mechanisms that might shift one's propensity to greater empathy and altruism further along this caring continuum from selfishness to altruism. So when we first started studying altruistic kidney donors, we noticed there was some significant national variation in donation rates. states, even for this very rare behavior. So what you're seeing here is the darker states have higher rates of altruistic kidney donors. And then we noticed this map looked a lot like another map from around that time of state-level well-being across the United States. So this is subjective well-being. It's your assessment of your quality of life. So this looks interesting. Does this bear out when we look at it more closely? We see when we do look at altruistic kidney donation rates against well-being in a correlation analysis, which you see here, this relationship holds, even when controlling for a number of demographic variables that I'll show you in a moment. And you might see Utah as an outlier all the way on the side there, but this also holds if we remove Utah as a very high donation state. So again, this is just showing that this association between subjective well-being and altruistic kidney donation rates across the United States, it holds, and even only controlled for median income, racial, gender, age, demographics, measures of mental and physical health across the states, and also income inequality. And to better understand the relationship between these variables, we also looked at association with changes in objective well-being, which here we looked at as median income and improvement in median income. And we found that while objective well-being was associated with donation rates across the United States, this relationship was mediated by subjective well-being. So changes in subjective well-being, which may co-occur with objective well-being, are still explaining the variance in donation rates across the United States. We'll also just briefly highlight that my Georgetown colleagues recently extended these results using recent data on 7 forms of altruism across the world. So you can create an altruism map, much like the other one, across the United States. And again, you can see this looks quite similar to when we look at subjective well-being country ratings across the world. So they compiled data on 7 altruistic behaviors across dozens of nations and found evidence that these behaviors reflect this latent construct positively associated with national level subjective well-being, and also interestingly with individualist values by country. Even when they controlled for national level wealth, health, education, and also shared cultural history. So let's show you some examples of what these correlations looks like. So we've seen significant positive association between subjective well-being and blood donation, being a bone marrow donor, being registered, kidney donation, volunteering, charitable donation, everyday helping, and also animal welfare. And to highlight that effective individualism again, they saw that the association between subjective well-being and altruism across the world is sort of moderated by this individualism. So if a country is particularly high on individualism, they're showing this strong positive association. But if they're particularly low on individualism, so a standard deviation below the mean here, they're really not showing an association between well-being and rates of altruistic behaviors. And this individualism piece in particular may be confusing to some. You may think that if you're going to be selfish, it's going to be referred to as individualist as well. But it's generally been shown to be the case that individualist societies or groups are actually broadly more pro-social, especially towards strangers, whereas collectivist societies or groups tend to focus more on helping their in-group country. So just to briefly summarize, so across the United States and across the world, greater subjective well-being is associated with both extraordinary and also more ordinary forms of altruistic behavior. And while correlational, this highlights that improvements to well-being at a societal level may be a means for increasing a propensity for altruistic over selfish behavior. So now I'll wrap up with a few conclusions. So during this pandemic, we've seen behavior exemplary of both ends of the potential ranging from selfish to selfless, in which our behaviors so clearly affected so many others, many of them strangers. The series of studies I presented today begins to tell us a bit about this range of behaviors and how we might tilt the scales from more selfish to more altruistic behavior. So I described a potential current continuum in which extreme altruism and extreme selfishness make up the anchors of the distribution, with most of us falling somewhere in between. We saw that highly altruistic people show greater evidence for neural markers of empathy, for fear and pain in strangers, though even with a brief empathy prompt, non-altruists could show this heightened degree of self-other overlap. This greater consideration for strangers was further supported by both self-reported ratings of closeness and also decreased discounting of outcomes from more socially distant others. We saw evidence for the neural basis of cognitive empathy and selfishness, in which manipulation of the TPJ eliminated differential treatment of a physically present versus abstract interaction partner. And importantly, though this results highlighted that stimulating this area may not result in less selfishness overall, but rather, though this study results highlighted that stimulating this area may not result in less selfishness overall, there wasn't any difference there. We might see even more differential treatments of interaction partners depending on the social context and how distinct they may seem if we were to try something, for example, like stimulating this area, so that in a sedentary way. So that might not be a potential solution to selfishness in that individual level. And lastly, we saw evidence for an interesting relationship between subjective well-being and helping, both across the United States with respect to altruistic kidney donation and around the world for several types of altruistic behavior. And while correlational, this highlights another potential avenue for shifting us towards more altruism and away from selfishness. If improving people's quality of life and sense of thriving can allow them to extend their scope of concern beyond themselves and even beyond those they are closest to, much like the altruistic kidney donors. So thank you so much for your time and attention, and I look forward to your questions.
I'll let you begin.
Sure. Mm-hmm. Sure. Yes, to summarize, I think she's asking about the difference between really focusing on empathy and helping others, but also realizing you need to take care of yourself to an extent. I think I agree there is a balance, and I think that's why most of us fall somewhere in between, where we haven't engaged in these very extraordinary behaviors, but also we're not so self-focused that we're harming others by our choices. So I think there definitely is a balance between considering others and their needs, but also making sure you're taking care of yourself as well. I think we see that with the well-being results. If you're not feeling you're thriving in life, that you have a high quality of life, then perhaps to an extent you're not able to extend your concern to others.
Thank you very much. Just off the back of that, you explained the evolutionary basis of selfishness. I wondered if there's a theory for evolutionary basis of altruism.
Yes, I didn't touch on it here, but some related work we've done has, and also lots of other work has supported the idea that altruism at least partly comes from parental caregiving. So we're very ingrained to care, especially for offspring, but also for kin, for family. And I think it's hypothesized that our highly cooperative way of being as a human species requires that we extend that beyond our immediate kin groups as well, even for our own success.
I was wondering, therefore, when you showed the data with human altruists, have they been taught in some way, exposed? I was thinking, for example, when you somebody who might have needed a kidney, and they learned to become altruists through that kind of thing.
Yeah, so we asked about that a bit. Did you specifically know someone who had donated a kidney, or did you know someone who needed a kidney? Generally, the answer was no. of course, there's going to be some individual variation there. But it was usually the narrative that they just heard a news story or even saw a billboard, for example, that someone needed a kidney, and once they realized that was something they could do, they immediately wanted to engage in activity.
I have some questions on behalf of Gehrman. How would you define the term selfishness?
Yes, I think the way we try to define it throughout the studies that we conducted here at Penn is it's really this holding on to more resources relative to someone that you're interacting with. It's kind of this almost selfish hoarding that's going to negatively affect others. That's really what we try to focus on with the way we operationalize that.
Nice. And then the second question is, are there normal and abnormal selfishness?
So I think there's a number of psychopathologies that are characterized by particularly selfish and unempathic behavior. And again, this would include people who are particularly high in psychopathic or narcissistic traits. So I'd say that's where you're probably going to see that what we consider to be the most pathological levels of selfishness. But we do see empathic deficits across a number of psychopathologies. Yeah.
I think in the social emotion studies, but there's also what looks like different neurological behavior.
I'm trying to think of what you're referring to.
The altruism involves sort of lateral control and more the split level.
Yeah.
A lot of activity that you control for the altruism.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about. We didn't have particular hypotheses for that, so we didn't really speculate on what might be going on there. We didn't expect any particular differences in kind of posterior areas of the brain there. While we did whole brain analyses, we were particularly focused on the areas we expected in the kind of the empathy for pain network. So again, really focusing on the anterior insula and some of the cortex. We didn't really have speculations for why there might be those differences there. Yes. Sure. Yeah, so she's asking how automatic or deliberative different types of empathy might be. I think kind of the perhaps unsatisfying answer is that they're both. So we probably have levels of, and this might vary by individual as well, and we kind of saw that in some of our studies where we saw kind of the automatic response with someone else's emotional pain versus when you're prompted to try to think more about that. So again, emotional empathy is more this kind of self-other resonance, emotional resonance that we might have. You're not necessarily feeling the exact same emotion, but if you see someone else in pain or upset, you begin to feel negatively yourself to an extent. Again, and cognitive empathy is more putting yourself in someone else's shoes, trying to think about their perspective, which can be emotional in nature, but doesn't have to be. It can just be understanding their situation. Yes. So she was asking if there's any way to kind of intervene in childhood to make children more empathic or pro-social. So that's not my area of expertise, but I think there have been some studies trying to emphasize that early on and also encourage pro-social behaviors that they can become more common and perhaps more moving it towards more automatic. So that could potentially be an avenue, but that's not my area.